Hello and welcome to our fourth session, which is a continuation on our investment appraisal session. This session deals with discounted cash flow techniques. And as already indicated, discounted cash flow techniques incorporates the principle of time value of money in the appraisal process. One of the first items we're going to look at is the net present value. Now, net present value intrinsically is a net or the remaining value after present values have been set off. Now, in looking at it from the layman's terms, in a typical assessment of profit positions, profit is typically referred to as or given as revenue minus cost. But given our understanding of time value of money, it does not make sense, therefore, to take revenues received across different accounting periods or different time periods and add them up in the typical accounting format and then less the initial investment to arrive at profit. So in this regard, what we do under net present value is to indicate that all cash flows received over different time periods need to be discounted accordingly before the subtraction of the initial cost, which is normally let off in time zero. So then net present value can be captured typically as a revised form of profit which incorporates the time value of money. And so we look at NPV as a total present of all future cash flows to be received from a project. In this case, we are saying plus the initial investment, because the initial investment is always captured as an outflow. So this is what we have. How do we estimate NPV? You should be able to estimate your future cash flows. The truth is, how much and when are they going to flow in? Also be able to determine your discount rate, which is typically a reflection of the cost of capital that the firm is exposed to, and also be able to estimate the initial costs that go into setting up the project. Once these are well captured, then of course we come back to the principle that if an investment, even in accounting terms, over its economic life makes profits that are less than zero or negative profits, nobody accepts that. And so the same minimum acceptance criteria is reflected in that we only accept projects if the NPV is greater than zero, meaning over the economic life of the investment, it adds value because then the cash flows to be received from the project exceed the initial cost after we have adjusted for time value of money. And so therefore, when it comes to ranking, you choose the projects with the highest net present value. Now, why should we use net present value in appraising projects? Now, normally when you accept positive NPV projects, it benefits shareholders because typically it uses cash flows and not just accounting profits. Now, NPV uses all the cash flows of the project, not just some. And then NPV also discounts the cash flows accordingly based on risk and market elements. Now, when it comes to the reinvestment assumption, the NPV rule assumes that all cash flows can be reinvested as the discount rate on the market. Now, let's look at a second technique that falls under the discounted cash flow techniques, and this has to do with the internal rate of return. Now, in looking at it from the layman's point of view, the internal rate of return can be seen as a rate of return that is embedded in an investment. Now, a good finance manager is able to glean the relevant information to know the internal rate of return because its relevance in determining whether or not to embark on the project, given parameters like cost of capital and all, is very crucial. Now, we can see the internal rate of return that typically discounts, or the rate that sets the NPV of a project to zero, meaning that it is the rate that when used to discount the expected cash inflows from a project will equate the present value of all future inflows to the cost. Therefore, it is typically the interest rate that ensures that we break even. Now, for that reason, the minimum acceptance criteria should be that we accept a project if the internal rate of return exceeds our required rate of return. By implication, what it means is that if the rate of return to be made from the project exceeds the required rate of return or the cost of capital to be paid in acquiring funds to embark on the project, then the project is acceptable. And when it comes to ranking, we normally will select the alternative with the highest internal rate of return. Now, the reinvestment assumption concludes that all future cash flows can be reinvested at the internal rate of return. Now, this is not to say that the internal rate of return has not got disadvantages. Normally, it does not really help to distinguish between investing and borrowing, and in some cases, IRR may not exist at all, or there may be multiple internal rates of return. In the case of multiple internal rates of return, this presents the complicated situation of determining which one to accept in making a decision as to whether the capital that you're going to use is affordable or not affordable. And especially when it comes to mutually exclusive projects, meaning projects that only allow you to choose one and let go of the other, you may have problems in using the internal rate of return as your decision criteria. The main advantage, however, is that it's quite easy to understand and communicate because it tells you the rates of return you are making. Now, let's look at another option, which is the discounted payback. Now, typically, it follows the principle of the payback, but in this case, we consider time value of money in the computation. So what it means is that instead of using the nominal accounting values as we did in the payback period, when it comes to the discounted payback, we first and foremost will discount the expected cash flows. Only then do we compute the payback. The decision rule, therefore, is to accept the project if it pays back given on a discounted basis within the specified time desired by management. And of course, it stands to reason that by the time you have discounted the relevant cash flows, you might as well calculate the NPV so that you know how much value is created and not just when the project will pay back the initial investment. So now let's look at some examples incorporating the IRR, the NPV, the payback, and see how they play out. So consider the following project that has the initial cost of 200. Now, with the initial cost of 200 and then the expected cash flows of 50 in year 1, 100 in year 2, and 150 in year 3, the internal rate of return for the project is proxied at 19.44. Now, at 19.44, now let's try and look at a profile which is graphing the NPV of a project versus the discount rate. We can see that the IRR is at the point where we cross over on the x-axis. Now, if you look at the profile to the left side of the graph, it means that somewhere between 16% and 20% we transition from positive NP to negative NPV, meaning that somewhere in there we have the zero NPV, which is the break-even point, and beyond that we have negative NPV. Now, going further, therefore, the IRR is proxied as what? 19.44. Now, looking at the problems with the IRR, which is the multiple case, or whether we are borrowing or lending, and also the scale problem, when we've got multiple IRR, as already indicated, the problem is which one to use in arriving at a decision of whether to accept or to reject a project. If we are borrowing or lending, how does the case of the IRR help us? Because it does not differentiate between the borrower and the lender. And in terms of the scale problem, a peculiar example could be that you have got two projects. Given the ranking criteria, IRR says that accept the one with the highest rate. But if you have an investment that requires 1,000 USD investment and 1 million USD investment, and you are not constrained by capital, then would you accept a 1,000 investment that returns 50% return, or a 1 million investment that returns a 20% over its entire economic life? Obviously, the choice will be the 20%, albeit lower than a 50%, but because the scale problem makes the 20% a better investment compared to the 50% on an initial investment of 1,000. Now, when it comes to mutually exclusive versus independent projects, it means that for mutually exclusive, only one of several projects can be chosen. So then, if you rank all of them and you select one, as already mentioned, IRR could actually lead to conflicting decisions compared to the NPV. And when it comes to independent project, meaning that you can accept quite a number of them. Now, obviously, the main criteria is that it must exceed your minimum acceptance criteria, and once you're not constrained by capital, you may accept as many as you can possibly handle. Now, let's look at the case of the multiple IRR in a graphical form. And so we see that every time the NPV profile crosses the x-axis, we have an IRR. So the question is, which one should we use in making our decisions? And then this is just a clarification of the scale problem. Would you rather make 100% or 50% on your investment? If the 100% were on a $1 investment and the 50% were on a 1,000 investment, which one would you choose? I'm sure we all know the right answer. Now, when you come to compare NPV versus IRR, normally they'll give the same decision, especially where all parameters are within the conventional form. What do I mean by that? If cash flows are conventional, then it means NPV and IRR would normally give the same decisions. Now, when cash flows are conventional, it means it follows the pattern of literally sowing and harvesting, meaning that we invest in the beginning and then we receive positive cash flows into the future. But where we have non-conventional cash flows, meaning that we have periods where we have to reinvest, having negative cash flows somewhere during the future cash flow plan of the project, then we have cases where NPV and IRR will not normally arrive at the same decision. When it comes to mutually exclusive projects, we may have a case where they will conflict, and so where initial investments are also substantially different, IRR and NPV could generate conflicting. If the timing of cash flows are also quite different, then we also have conflicts. And so in the issue of having conflicts between NPV and IRR, the basic advice is normally a preference for NPV because it tells you how much value has been added. Now let's look at the last item, which is the profitability index. Now this looks at the present value of all future cash flows divided by the initial investment. Now typically this is more like a benefits cost ratio. So all things being equal, when the value is greater than 1, we accept it. What it means is that the future present value of all future cash flows exceeds the initial investment, hence the value in excess of 1. And so we reject otherwise. And when it comes to ranking, we select the alternative with the highest profitability index. Now, its main disadvantages in terms of profitability index is also the case of mutually exclusive projects because they can give very different assessments. But the main advantage is that it's useful when available funds are quite limited because it tells you the one that brings in the highest return for funds being put to use. It's quite easy to understand and communicate. And usually when it comes to evaluating independent projects, it helps to arrive at a more correct decision. Now let's look at how to incorporate that in capital budgeting decisions. Now, with the practice of capital budgeting, we normally realize that it varies by industry. Some firms may use payback, others use accounting rates of return. It usually depends on how easy they find that. The most frequently used techniques for large corporations, typically because they've got the expertise, is the internal rate of return and the NPV. Though a bit complicated in computing, they are quite valuable in how they affect the outcome for decision making. Now let's look at a few questions that would help clarify the issue of investments in general and the capital budgeting techniques. So then we are going to look at a few questions that you could try your hands on and then make your decisions as a good financial manager, which one we should accept or reject. Thank you very much. We see you in the next session.